So today we are having a next topic. We are having that is spleen. So this is also the part of lymphatic system. So what is spleen? Spleen is basically you can say that another lymphatic secondary tissue, another lymphatic secondary tissue, which means in this the nodes are basically present. Okay, and they basically work for the filtration of the lymph. Okay, so spleen is having the main role in the filtration of the lymph because they are having the lymph nodes too. Okay, so spleen is basically, if we talk about the location, so that is present in left upper side of abdomen. Okay, and you can say the upper side of the diaphragm. Okay, so if we talk about the spleen, so spleen is basically you can say that this is the secondary lymphatic tissue. Okay, if we talk about an embryonic stage, in embryonic stage, I mean that in fetus when the fetus is basically development before birth. Okay, so in spleen there is the process occur which is the erythropoietic. The erythropoietic basically is the process, okay, which is the RBC production, which means the RBC production. So before birth, when the baby is like in the embryonic stage or they're in the fetus is basically developing, so the RBC production of the baby is basically produced in the spleen. So we are also calling spleen as a erythropoietic organ. Okay, and if we talk about after birth, so after birth the role of spleen is basically they basically store the after birth they store the RBC. After that, the RBC is basically the produce in the bone marrow, and after birth, the spleen is having work for the storage of the RBC, or we are calling that as a RBC bank too. Okay, and one more thing, they basically store the RBC as well as the spleen is also called the graveyard of the RBC, which means when the RBC are basically going to die, so the dead RBC are basically stored in the spleen. Okay, so this is about the natural death of the RBC. Natural death of the RBC. So one more thing I want to tell you guys is that if we talk about the structure of the spleen, this was a little bit introduction about this organ. If we talk about the structure of spleen, so that is also like, as you guys all know, I told you guys about the lymph nodes. Okay, in spleen lymph nodes are also there. So this is the layer, this is a not trabecula but the splenic fibrous capsula, which means this is the basically the this is a layer which is fibrous, and this is used for the production of the spleen. Okay, and this is the layer of spleen, so that's why we are calling that as a splenic fibrous capsule. Okay, inside that we are having the trabecula too. This is the channel or duct like structure. Okay, with that, here we are calling that as a red pulp. What is red pulp? Red pulp is basically where the cluster of RBC are basically stored. Here there is a cluster of the RBC. We are calling that cluster as a red pulp. With there in the center we are having this structure. This is we are calling it a white pulp. What is white pulp? White pulp is basically where the lymphocytes are present. Where the lymphocytes are present plus macrophages. These basically having a big role in the killing of the pathogen, which is the, you can say that the any antigen is there, any foreign particle is there. So for killing of that particle, we are having a great role of the lymphocyte and the macrophages. They basically destroy the pathogen, and macrophages are basically the cells like structure, and they basically destroy the pathogen by the phagocytosis, which phagocytosis is the process for which the the foreign particle will get engulfed. Okay, that we are calling as a phagocytosis. So macrophages basically do the phagocytosis for the killing of the pathogen. So this was about the spleen structure. In spleen we are having the main role of the lymphocyte and the macrophages for the killing of the pathogen. Okay, so that's why we are calling that as another lymphatic secondary tissue. So this was about the spleen. In the next video we will moving toward the blood groups.